Part 73. The Prince is Very Fierce. Author, Guan Zi. Chapter 721. After entering the pass from Yanshan, Su Buling rode his horse at full speed and arrived at Yangshuo County. With Zhongli Jiju's guidance, he first found an inn in the county town to stay. Yangshuo County is the first town after entering Nanyu. It is located along the Jiang River and is a transportation hub between the north and the south. All kinds of people gather here. In addition to merchants from all over the world, people from southern Xinjiang wearing various costumes can be seen everywhere. There are hundreds of villages of all sizes among the mountains on the south side of Liuzhu. The 18 villages of Fishuling is among them, about 40 miles away from Yangshuo County in a straight line, but in the terrain of Nanyu, it may take a whole day to walk to the other side of the two villages across the mountains. Even Zhongli Jiju can't tell how far it is, but he only knows that he has to cross more than 20 mountains. It's too late. There are poisonous insects and tigers everywhere in the mountains and fields of Lingnan. It's not advisable to travel overnight. You have to rest for a night and set off again tomorrow morning. After putting down the gift in the inn, Zhongli Jiju covered her face a little and asked for information in the gambling house and wine shop outside the inn. Zhongli Chuchu served as a tour guide and took Su Buling, who came to South Vietnam for the first time, to walk around. In order to hide his identity, Su Buling got a local native's clothes to wear. He always wore a snow-white robe, but suddenly changed into a rather wild foreign outfit. He was still handsome but had a different flavor. Zhongli Chuchu, who saw him for the first time, was really amazed, but he naturally did not show it in front of Su Buling. Zhongli Chuchu also changed back to the clothes of her hometown, wearing a blue skirt and silver ornaments. She was afraid of being recognized by acquaintances, so she still covered her face with a veil. The two walked together on the small street. The small buildings on the street were quite characteristic of South Vietnam, but as a place where people from all walks of life gathered, like the Central Plains, there were many brothels and gambling houses, and it was a bit chaotic. Zhongli Chuchu wanted to be a good host and introduce Su Buling to the local customs and practices, but after looking around, she had nothing to say. She couldn't tell Su Buling that there were black pearls from overseas, or blue-eyed foreign horses like her, in a brothel in front. The two walked for a while, and before Zhongli Chuchu could think of what to say, she found that Su Buling's eyes were always looking around, and occasionally sniffed and sniffed, as if he was looking for something. She said with a little surprise, "What are you looking for?" Su Buling smiled and said, "Looking for Liuzhu snail noodles. I have only heard of it before, but I have never eaten it. I have to see it when I come here." Zhongli Chuchu was puzzled and thought carefully, "What is snail noodles? I have been in Liuzhu for many years and have never heard of it. Where did you hear it from?" Su Buling was a little disappointed when he heard it. "I heard from the storyteller that it is extremely smelly but delicious. Once you eat it, you will become addicted." Zhongli Chuchu heard extremely smelly. There was a clear displeasure in his eyes, and he frowned. Although our Nanyu is a little poor, it is only inferior to the Guangzhou area. To be honest, it is much more prosperous than the western regions. Moreover, this place was governed by the great chief for 300 years before it was under the jurisdiction of the Nanyu court 60 years ago. The food here is no different from that in the Central Plains. How can you eat something extremely smelly? You Central Plains people like to belittle foreigners. These words are not credible." Su Buling was not good at explaining, so he just shook his head and smiled, and followed Chuchu to stroll on the street. Zhongli Chuchu used to travel around Yangshuo County. It was boring to walk aimlessly with Su Buling, so he thought of going to a small tavern he knew to see if there were any acquaintances he knew before to inquire about the news. Zhongli Chuchu's first stop in the world of martial arts was Yangshuo County. He had some connections there, but just as they walked to the vicinity of the wine shop, before they had time to go in, A conversation came from the wine shop. Brother Huan, the situation is tense recently. We are still wanted in Daewoo. If we run away and get caught now, it will be worse than being captured by the court. What are you afraid of? The concubine of the son of the regent of Daewoo is my friend from the past. If something happens, just report her name. The son of the regent of Daewoo. Su Buling frowned and thought for a while before realizing that the person he was talking about was himself. The voice sounded familiar. When he met Chuchu in Chang'an City before, Chuchu and several South Yu martial artists pretended to be envoys from the overseas Baisha kingdom and went to Chang'an City to meet the emperor and defraud rewards. The leader, Hu Yanja, had worked with him in Renai Hall. He had some impression of him because he appeared with Chuchu. One of the people talking in the wine shop looked very much like Hu Yanja, who had met him several times in Chang'an City. Su Buling stopped and wanted to ask Chuchu if he wanted to say hello. He looked over and saw Zhongli Chuchu with a cold look in her eyes and gnashing teeth. She had obviously heard the conversation in the wine shop and understood that the concubine was referring to her. Su Buling smiled in his heart, but he still asked calmly, Chuchu, what's wrong? It seems that it was Hu Yanja in front. I met him once in Chang'an City before. Zhongli Chuchu and Hu Yanja went to Chang'an to cheat rewards. They were just a group of people from the Jianghu teaming up to do business at odd hours. They were not even friends, but just acquaintances. Zhongli Chuchu was naturally dissatisfied when she was called Su Buling's concubine by the other party. But it was not easy to say it directly, so she just said calmly. Hu Yanja has been around Liuzhu for many years. He is considered a local tyrant here. He has a wide network of contacts and knows a lot of things. You ask about the situation in the village, and I won't show up. Otherwise, these people will definitely stick to you and try to establish a relationship with you. It will be difficult for me to chase them away if I am there. Su Buling naturally understood the truth that the poor are ignored in the downtown, but the rich have distant relatives in the mountains, so he asked Chuchu to wait at the corner of the tavern, and he entered the tavern with a scimitar. The old wine shop didn't even have a signboard, and the aroma of wine was overwhelming even before you entered the door. However, judging from Su Buling's experience of drinking wine for so many years, it can only be regarded as an upper-middle-class standard, but in this small county in remote southern Xinjiang, it is indeed rare to see good wine. In the wine shop, several small wine tables were occupied by guests. On the wine table in the corner, 3 men were sitting together. The leader was Hu Yanja, the Baisha foreign ambassador back then. The scimitar was placed on the table with a package beside it, obviously preparing for a long journey. The 2 accomplices next to him met each other, and Su Buling had never seen them before. They should be Hu Yanja's new friends. At this time, they were asking dubiously. Brother Huan, the concubine you are talking about is our Bagui fairy Zhongli from South Vietnam, right? She is a fairy-like figure, do you know her? Hu Yanja held the wine bowl with an enigmatic look on his face. What am I trying to do to you? If you don't believe me, go out and ask around. When Zhongli and Chuchu came out to run around, I was the one who led the way. A few years ago, we went to Chang'an to do business, and she was there. At that time, I met the son of the king of Ziliang, and from then on he flew up a branch and became a phoenix. I know these things clearly. Not only was I there, but I also had an encounter with Su Buledin, the son of the king of Ziliang, who is the contemporary best player in the world. Ling, we have learned a few tricks, and it's fair to say that we don't know each other even if we don't fight. Brother Huan even knows Daewoo's best master in the world. Have you ever competed with him? Hu Yanja really knew Su Buling. Although he was almost beaten to death with a piece of silver, it was still considered a fight. He nodded with a clear conscience at the moment. Jianghu people don't tell lies. Have you heard of Zhuangyuan Street in Chang'an City? At that time, My brother had a conflict with someone and blocked Su Buling's carriage. Su Buling was unhappy and raised his hand to kill me. My brother was beaten. I didn't know Su Buling at that time, so I slapped the table and fought with him, and I was unscathed afterwards. Hey! The two friends were full of surprise. Seeing that Hu Yanja didn't seem to be lying, they asked with hesitation. Brother Huan is indeed a hero among men. I heard that Su Buling is too handsome to look like a human being, and he is also nicknamed Zhao Hongyaimei. What does he really look like? Oh, it's all nonsense from people in the world. The real person is very elegant. I can't tell the difference between male and female. He's just taller. While Hu Yanja was talking, he noticed from the corner of his eye a man wearing meow clothes walking in from the door of the wine shop. He glanced at it briefly and raised his chin. Just like this guy, he looks, damn. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 722. The two brothers were looking back following Hu Yanja's eyes when they suddenly heard a heartbreaking exclamation coming from beside them, making them tremble in fright. Looking back, Brother Huan, who had been chatting just now, jumped 3 feet high and jumped directly to the corner of the wine shop. He leaned against the wall and stared at the door. He opened his mouth and wanted to say something but couldn't. Brother Huan, what are you doing? The expressions of the two men changed slightly. They thought an enemy was coming. They both touched the weapons at their sides and looked cautiously at the door. Su Buling walked into the wine shop with a machete in hand. Seeing Hu Yanja's reaction, he knew that he was frightened. He raised his hand slightly and smiled. Brother Huan, long time no see. Don't panic, two brothers. We are all friends. After Hu Yanja heard the voice, he confirmed that the handsome man in strange clothes in front of him was really Prince Su, the crown prince of Daewoo. Hu Yanja was just a small character running around in South Vietnam. It was a bit unbelievable that such a great king of hell suddenly came to his door. Su Buling sat down at the wine table, took a wine bowl, filled it with wine, and said with a smile. Brother Huan. Hu Yanja dared to enter Chang'an to defraud the Daewoo Court of Rewards. He still had the courage and reaction. It took him a moment to confirm that it was not a nightmare. He glanced left and right, then walked over quickly. It turns out to be Brother Shining. We haven't seen him for many years and I didn't recognize him for a while. Then he looked at the two men next to him. You guys should go back first. This brother and I haven't seen each other for many years. We need to get together and talk about leaving the country in a while. The two men were a little confused, but they didn't say much. After saying goodbye, they got up and left the wine shop. Su Buling took a sip from the wine bowl and then patted the seat next to him. Brother Huan has a good memory, he even remembers my flower name. Only then did Hu Yanja dare to sit down next to him, with a slightly embarrassed smile. Young master is so well known, it's hard to remember. I wonder why young master suddenly came to this small fish pond in South Vietnam? If there is anything I can do to help, I don't seem to be able to help. Su Buling poured a bowl of wine for Hu Yanja and said warmly, we are acquainted with each other, so there is no need to be so nervous. I just heard that something happened to my daughter-in-law's family, so I came to see what was going on. Brother Huyan has been walking around Liu's all year round, has he ever know? Hu Yanja was stunned for a moment. He really didn't expect that the noble prince of the vassal could go deep into the enemy's territory for a concubine. He thought for a moment, then nodded and said. Young master is really serious. It's just a small matter of fighting between a few villages. A few days ago, young master was fighting in Chu, and most of King Wei's army outside the pass withdrew. Our court began to go crazy, recruiting young men from all over the place to serve as troops. We and the Central Plains is different. The villages in the mountains are owned by the village owners, and the county magistrate has no control over them. But if a war really breaks out, the court still has to provide people. Each village has a quota based on its population. If there are not enough people, food will be provided. Minato. The 18 large and small villages on the Phi Shui Ridge side were originally owned by the old village in Niang Mountain. For some reason, the imperial court specified that the old village had 200 people. Counting the old, young, women, and children, there were only about 800 people in the old village. Where could they go? Looking for so many strong men? So I said hello to the 18th village, and if I didn't follow the rules, I wouldn't let anyone in. It turned out that the 18 villages were not of the same mind. Zhan Bao, the head of Yinpo village, went to report to the officials that bandits were hiding in Niang Mountain, and he also fanned the flames. He told other villages that Niang Mountain was causing trouble and that those who did not listen to the government would harm everyone. Disaster. Then the government killed chickens to scare monkeys, led troops to the 18 villages, and arrested all the heads of Niang Mountain. I heard that a few of them were beheaded on the spot. The other villages were not united, no one took the lead and did not dare to stop them. Now that Zhan Bao is in charge, the government has taken a step back and reduced the quota, and things have calmed down, but I don't know where those people who were captured by the court went. Su Buling listened quietly and nodded slightly. It's not a big deal to say. Under normal circumstances, the news cannot even spread to the county town. But people who fled from Liuzhu to Chuti basically know whether there is someone there. Are you deliberately promoting this? Hu Yanjia was a little confused. Has it all spread to Chu? How could such a trivial matter like sesame seeds and mung beans spread so far? He thought for a moment and said uncertainly, however, the government does not recruit young men according to the rules. It really caused panic in Liuzhu area some time ago. There are many people talking about it recently, so if you are interested, it would not be surprising to know. Su Buling analyzed it and found that there were no valuable clues. It seemed that he had to go to Phi Shui Ridge to understand clearly. He put down the wine bowl and asked, "How much does Brother Huan know about the affairs of the South Vietnamese court? I heard that the South Vietnamese monarch is suffering from a serious illness, and the person in charge is a duke." When Hu Yanjia heard this, he smiled. "I am just a Jianghu person, and I don't know much about the affairs of the imperial court, but I have heard some rumors from Jianghu people talking nonsense in private. When our king first succeeded to the throne, he was still a wise monarch and had an excellent reputation among the people. Later, there was a beauty contest in the Central Plains. Before Miss Chu Chu, there was a beauty named Zhou in Nanyu. The girl naturally entered the palace and became the king's concubine." Su Buling nodded lightly, having heard about this. However, concubine Zhou became famous at about the same time as concubine Su, nearly 10 years earlier than Yu He, who finally closed the book. She belonged to the first wave, which was already more than 20 years ago. It's a matter of time. Maybe men are born with some compassion for beauties. When Hu Yanjia said this, he shook his head and sighed. There is a saying in the world that Su Danking's pen is poisonous. As long as the beauties he paints, none of them will die a good death. Our concubine Zhou did not escape the disaster. After entering the palace and giving birth to the prince, she passed away in a very strange way. It is said that she had driven on a trip the day before and died of illness in the imperial city the next day. Since then, the king has become depressed. He has no intention of governing and drinks all day long. Everything is left to the courtiers to take care of. A few years ago, there were rumors that the king drank too much and fell ill, lying in bed unable to even speak. The imperial court has been spending a lot of money to search for famous doctors, and many experts have gone to the capital to try their hands. Unfortunately, they all returned without success. Now the person in charge of the imperial court seems to be Angwo Gong Jochin. When Su Buling heard this, he nodded slightly. "I have very few records about Angwo Gong Jochin. Do you know his origins?" Hu Yanjia shook his head. Dignified Duke of the State, how can I come into contact with my identity? However, Duke Nguo is the father of the daughter. He only made his fortune after Zhou Gaifei entered the palace. He seemed to be the small county magistrate of Lingshan County in the past, and he was also in the market. There's no illusion. Su Buling nodded, knowing that he couldn't ask too many useful things, so he didn't say much, put down the wine bowl and stood up. Brother Huan, please come out of seclusion now. Someone will secretly escort you on the way. At least we got to know each other. When we get to Dayo, if nothing else, it's okay to have a half-official position. Hu Yanjia naturally understood the meaning and quickly stood up and clasped his fists. Young master is so polite. It's a blessing for me to be able to ride for you. I'll leave now and never come into contact with anyone. Su Buletinling nodded, stood up and left the wine shop. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. The Prince is Very Fierce. Author, Guan Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 723. When I came out of the wine shop, the moon was already on the branches. Su Buling came to the corner of the alley with a pot of wine. Zhongli Chuchu, who had been waiting for a long time, came over and asked. How's it going? Have you heard any news? Su Buling shook his head. It's nothing critical. It's just that Zhan Bao colluded with the government to pull out the old village and became the boss. I don't know where the elders in the village were taken. I have to go there tomorrow and ask. Zhongli Chuchu followed Su Buling back, with a bit of anger in her eyes. That Zhan Bao has never been a good guy. When he was young, he relied on his martial arts to run rampant in the 18 villages. How high is your martial arts skill? It's almost the same as King Yi. When Zhongli Chuchu said this, he felt that the masters in the eyes of ordinary Jianghu people were really not on the stage in front of Grand Master Wu Kuei, so he hummed softly. You probably only need one finger to hold him down. Su Buling raised his eyebrows and said with a smile. You praise him too much. Now I can fight 2 Songyings, Songying can fight 3 Tangjiao, and Tangjiao can fight 3 Zhongxiangs. Zhongxiang and Qingye are not far apart. In total, it is the combat power of 12 Xiangs to fight Yuxiang. You don't even need to get close. Zhongli Chuchu didn't learn any good martial arts since he was a child, so he was just a little taller than Manzi. It was hard to understand how tall a martial artist could be. After hearing this statement, she thought about it seriously. How can you calculate this? If you didn't know the solution to the dragon locking goo, you wouldn't have had to run away when you met my master and me. That's true. Su Buring did not deny it. He carried the wine bottle and returned to the inn where he stayed with Chu Chu. Zhongli Juju went out to inquire about the news, but had already returned and was sitting in the hall waiting. Su Buletinling and Juju communicated and found out that the information they got was almost the same, so they didn't say much. They had to get up early and rush to Phi Shui Ridge tomorrow, so the 3 of them went to the 2nd floor to rest together. When he was away from home, in order to protect the safety of his master and his apprentice, Su Buling naturally stayed close to each other and only opened 2 adjacent rooms. Zhongli Juju walked in front. When he came outside the room, he looked at the 2 doors and suddenly hesitated. Zhongli Juju was Su Buling's legitimate daughter-in-law. Logically speaking, she should sleep with her husband and her apprentice in another room. But there were only 3 people on this trip, and Chu Chu didn't even have a companion. How could she be embarrassed to be affectionate with her husband? Zhongli Juju hesitated for a moment, then turned around and said, Chu Chu, let's sleep together tonight. Zhongli Chuchu saw the master's thoughts. He counted the days when the master had sex last time and felt that the interval was a bit long, so he said generously. No, you and Su Buling can sleep in the same room. I'm a little tired, so I'm going to rest first. Zhongli Jiju was slightly happy, but also a little embarrassed. For a moment, she didn't know whether she should agree or not. Su Buling stood nearby, shook his head and smiled. How about we sleep together? Zhongli Jiju's expression condensed slightly, and then he glared at his husband with a slightly annoyed look. Zhongli Chuchu was stunned for a moment and looked at Su Buling with a strange look in his eyes. You, what do you mean? With pure eyes and no evil thoughts, Su Buling opened the door and walked into the house. The news about the village has spread too far, and what Chi Chi said makes sense. If someone is behind it, it's not safe to sleep in separate rooms. I may not be able to prevent all kinds of poisons in South Vietnam. You can sleep on the bed, and I can sleep on the stool. Zhongli Jiju knew how powerful the South Vietnamese poison master witch was, and there were many with her level. Those who dared to attack Su Buling were probably even higher than her level. She thought for a moment and then nodded gently. Okay, let's sleep together. Zhongli Chuchu knew his skills very well. Seeing that Su Buling was serious about his words, he didn't say much, lowered his head and followed him into the house. Phi Shui Ridge is located among lofty mountains and is named after a waterfall falling from the top of the mountain. The terrain in Lingnan is too complex, and there are basically no roads in and out. In order to protect against bandits and wild beasts, most of the mountain villages built here are built in steep places. Some of the villages have to climb up and down rock walls. However, if the inconvenience of access is not considered, the cottage terraces surrounded by beautiful scenery can be regarded as a paradise. There are 18 villages of various sizes in the dozens of miles surrounding Phi Shui Ridge. Their ancestors all originated from the old village in Niang Mountain. Later, more and more people in the old village could not accommodate them, and they slowly expanded outwards. Over the course of hundreds of years, only then did it reach its current scale. Niang Mountain is regarded as the ancestral temple of the 18 villages. Various gatherings are held here during the New Year and festivals. Young men and women from each village will come over to sing and dance around the bonfire in the village. It's a pity that after the turmoil in the past few days, Niang Mountain is obviously a little depressed. Half of the men in the village were forced to become young men by the imperial court, and only the old, young, women, and children were left in the village. The gate of the village was closed early, and under the moonlight there was no other sound except the crowing of chickens and the barking of dogs. Near the pool at the back of Niang Mountain, there is a small medicine garden where various common medicinal materials are grown. It was originally the property of Zhongli's family. After Zhongli Jiju left the village, the medicine garden was handed over to the village to take care of, and it is now quite tidy. On the side of the pool, there is a small house. The architectural style is completely different from the stilt buildings in the village. It is more like the buildings in the south of the Yangtze River. It was Zhongli Jiju's grandfather. After escaping from the war and fleeing here, he missed his hometown too much. The village the brothers and sisters there helped build it. Now, decades later, the courtyard has become a bit old. The gate is locked with a copper lock, and there is a carving on the door, which shows an adult holding a little girl with pigtails. This was secretly carved by Chuchu, who had suffered so much in the world when she was brought here. She really liked her master so much that she sat on the threshold and was in a daze. The courtyard has been uninhabited for several years. Someone often cleans the door, and it is still clean. Behind the gate, there is a thick layer of fallen leaves and dust, which looks very quiet in the bright night. It was past 3 o'clock in the morning, and the lights in the mountain village had gone out. A black crow flew silently across the night sky under the moonlight, landed on the eaves of the courtyard, and made 2 crow cries. After a while, the autumn wind swept through the fallen leaves, and a black figure appeared silently in the courtyard. In the dim moonlight, a figure can be seen wearing a black cloak, covering from head to toe, with only a few white hairs showing at the collar. He is hunched over and looks even a little sick. He is holding a twisted rattan cane, and the 5 fingers holding the cane are dry and pale, as if it is just a skeleton wrapped in wrinkled skin. The man in black is holding a cane and walking through the fallen leaves on the ground without making any sound. He stopped in front of the main house. He looked up for a moment, took out a silver needle from under the cloak, gently pierced it into the crack of the door above, stuck the mechanism ready to go, and took out another silver needle until all the light and dark traps were restricted. Then he opened the door and entered the house. Before Zhongli Jiju left, he had cleaned up the house, put all the things in the cabinet, and the bottles and jars were neatly placed on the table. Although there was no ventilation, there was no odor at all. The man in black looked around, and finally walked to the bedboard without bedding, took out a small porcelain bottle from his sleeve, took out an ant-sized insect from it with a silver needle, and carefully placed it between the gaps of the bedboard. After doing all this, the man in black silently exited the room and restored all the mechanisms and marks. As the night wind blew, the courtyard returned to its silent appearance in the past few years, as if no one had ever been here. It was late at night, and the small street gradually became quiet, leaving only the occasional laughter from the brothel that made people think about it. In the inn room, Su Buling lay on a bench, with a long sword at his side, closing his eyes and concentrating on sleeping. It was just that his hearing was too good, and at this moment, he was obviously a little unable to sleep. The autumn night was slightly cool, and the little beetle who liked cold and feared heat was released, lying on the window to bask in the moonlight, motionless. The little sparrow squatted on Su Buling's chest, as if it was a substitute for the master. Maybe it was also a little annoyed by the messy noises outside. The little sparrow occasionally pecked at Su Buling's chest with its beak, and only when Su Buling raised his hand to touch his head a few times did it quiet down again. Between the curtains, the master and the apprentice slept in their clothes. Zhongli Chuchu slept on the inside, a little tired from running around for days. Although Su Buling was in front of her, she had slept like this in the desert before, and there was nothing strange in her heart, so she fell asleep. Zhongli Jiju also closed her eyes and pretended to be asleep, but her eyelashes trembled slightly, and it was obvious that she had no intention of sleeping like Su Buling. Listening to the noises in the brothel outside, she was still muttering in her heart. The screams are so fake, I really can't stand it. How can this sound be? I have been traveling for more than 10 days, and I haven't been with my husband for a long time. I miss him so much. Thinking about it, the more I think about it, the more confused I feel. Zhongli Jiju secretly opened her eyes and glanced at Chuchu next to her. Seeing that Chuchu was already asleep, she carefully lifted the thin quilt, turned over and sat up, and walked barefoot to the bench silently. Su Buling opened one eye, glanced at the graceful silly wife, and then glanced at the curtain. Zhongli Jiju blushed and hesitated, but she had already gotten up, so she had to do something. She hesitated for a moment, leaned over and kissed Su Buling on the lips, and then ran back with a guilty conscience. But she didn't take 2 steps, and felt that it was not enough. She had already come here. She stopped, and seeing that Chuchu was not awake, she ran back and kissed her again. After several rounds of this, the clay Buddha was about to get angry. The last time he just stood up, he was held in his arms with his mouth covered. Rustle. The little sparrow had no place to live, so he could only fly to the window-sill next to him, stepping on the little beetle with his claws, watching his master standing there being bullied. Between the curtains, Zhongli Chuchu, who was facing the inside, had frowned without knowing when, and her hands were clenched tightly under the thin quilt. She closed her eyes and tried to pretend to be asleep, and her red lips were almost bitten. Thank you Asanhua for the leader reward. Thank you ha ha ha, I can't afford to offend for the leader reward. Thank you Yuhanya for the 50,000 reward. Thank you Queen Mother Baby is the best in the world for the 10,000 reward. If you give rewards, you can send gifts to Queen Mother Baby. It is estimated that I can get enough first-class stars before the book is finished. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 724. The autumn morning disperses the mist in the mountains and fields. As far as the eye can see, apart from the thousands of mountains, there are only empty mountains and birds chirping. Leaving Yangshuo County and entering the mountains of southern Xinjiang, after walking less than 10 miles, it seemed like I had stepped out of the human world. It seemed that no one had set foot in the dense mountain forests since ancient times. If there were not some stones between the mountain streams for people to step on and cross the river, it would be difficult to imagine the mountains. There are still people living in the depths. There was no highway at all on the road. It was over mountains and brooks, and the horseback riding target was too big and inconvenient. The three of them walked directly through the mountains and fields. Su Buring was wearing blue meow clothing, with a luggage hanging on his waist. Because there were too many poisonous insects in the mountains and fields, he also wore leggings. The rugged mountain road felt like walking on flat ground for Su Buring. It was easier to walk at this time. From time to time, he stood on high places and admired the beautiful scenery that was completely different from the central plains. The little sparrow was too lazy to fly, squatting on Su Buring's shoulder, looking at the two masters behind him, chirping, obviously urging him to walk faster. Zhongli Jiju is also good at martial arts, but if he wants to return to Fai Shuling's village, the straight line distance is more than 40 miles, and he has to go through mountains and ridges in many twists and turns. If the route is spread out, it is estimated to be hundreds of miles, and the road is still very difficult to walk. It tests endurance. In order to maintain his physical strength, Zhongli Jiju would naturally not sprint with all his strength. He would just walk slowly with his hiking pole. Occasionally he would encounter landmarks or scenery, and he would also tell various stories about living here before. Zhongli Chuchu was wearing a blue meow skirt and followed the two of them. She was holding a branch in her hand and aimlessly sweeping the flowers and plants on the roadside. Her green eyes like cat eyes were slightly tired, and there were two black circles. Obviously a little sleepy. Zhongli Jiju walked for a while, and gradually realized that Chu Chu was not in good spirits. He slowed down and walked beside him, saying with concern, "Chu Chu, are you okay if you didn't sleep last night? Why do you keep dozing off? What do you think?" When Zhongli Chuchu heard this, he felt a little angry. Last night, the three of them were in the same room. She thought that the master was not so courageous, so she went to sleep peacefully. As a result, in the middle of the night, I suddenly heard a sizzling sound, and the master behind me disappeared. How could Zhongli Chuchu not know what was going on behind her back? She felt ashamed, angry, and embarrassed, but couldn't get up, so she could only pretend not to notice and continue to sleep with her eyes closed. Who would have thought that this wait would only take a few hours? The two of them were sitting on the stool for a while, and for a while on the table, which filled the room with a strange smell. Zhongli Chuchu was not a nun without passion, so she couldn't bear it, and her clothes were sweating a little. When the work was finally done, the master lay down and fell asleep contentedly, but Zhongli Chuchu was upset and kept struggling until daybreak when the energy was suppressed. Zhongli Chuchu's eyes showed a bit of unspeakable annoyance, but he couldn't express it clearly. He just lowered his head and hummed softly. "I didn't sleep well last night. I kept hearing the sound of mice stealing food." "Master, didn't you hear it?" Zhongli Jiju's concerned expression froze, thought for a moment, and made a smile. "Really? I slept quite deeply last night and didn't pay attention." "Yi, did you hear it?" Twitter. "Look, Yi didn't hear it either. Maybe she heard something wrong." "Little sparrow?" Zhongli Chuchu had nothing to say, so she patted her master's buttocks with a small branch. "You go ahead, I'm a little tired and don't want to talk." Zhongli Jiju felt that Chu Chu had discovered what happened last night, and she felt so unreasonable that she dared to say anything. She pursed her lips and smiled, lowered her head and continued walking beside Chu Chu. Su Buling was quite bored walking slowly. Hearing the conversation between master and apprentice, he walked back and looked at Chu Chu. The road is still far away. I'll carry you on my back. You lie down and sleep for a while. Naturally, Zhongli Jiju would not stop her, and pulled Chu Chu's sleeve. Yes, take a rest before you have a good sleep. You have to get to Phai Shuling before dark, so it's not good to just leave like this. How could Zhongli Chuchu be willing to let Su Buling carry her? The last time she lay on Su Buling's back to grind peanuts was still fresh in her mind. But before Zhongli Chuchu could refuse, Su Buling squatted down in front of her, and the master who was helping the villain raised his hand and pushed her. Ah! Zhongli Chuchu lost his balance and lay on Su Buling's back, and then he was carried on his back. In order to maintain balance, he could only hold Su Buling's shoulders, feeling a little anxious and embarrassed. Put me down, I can leave by myself. Su Buletinling tilted up, asked Chu Chu to lie down, and said with a smile. You're welcome, it's just a little effort. Why am I being polite? Zhongli Chuchu's face turned red, and she could clearly feel the heat in Su Buling's palm. She twisted a few times to get further away, but the more she moved, the clearer the feeling became. Zhongli Chuchu declined Su Buling several times and refused to let go. In desperation, he could only spread his legs, clamp Su Buling's waist, and let him hug his legs. Su Buletinling waited for Chu Chu to sit down before he started walking again and walked deeper into the mountains. Zhongli Jiju followed beside him and continued to chat about the customs of southern Xinjiang. Zhongli Chuchu was restless and didn't want to lie on Su Buling's back, but as a standard beauty from the western regions with a very proud figure, if she wanted her bulging skirt to not stick to Su Buling's back, she had to lean back. After a while, he could only accept his fate and move forward, lying on Su Buling's back. The three of them were walking in the mountains and fields. Zhongli Chuchu looked at the master who was smiling sweetly next to him, and Su Buling who was smiling and chatting in front of him. For some reason, he suddenly felt like a family of three were traveling together. Zhongli Chuchu has never had a home since she could remember, and she doesn't even remember what her parents looked like. She once lived in Gulan, watching young couples strolling on the street carrying children of her own age, and imagined that she could do the same. But now that she really feels like this, Zhongli Chuchu is not happy at all, but feels very awkward. After all, the man carrying her behind her back should be her lover. I really didn't sleep well last night, and Su Buletinling's steps were very steady, and he didn't take the opportunity to move his feet. Zhongli Chuchu lay down for a moment, thinking wildly, and gradually felt sleepy. She hesitated a little, then rested her cheek on her shoulder. The sun rises and sets, turning from morning light to sunset. The scenery on the road is beautiful and dazzling. Every time you reach an open area with a water source, you can see Miao villages hidden in the mountains. The stilted wooden buildings are built among the mountains and canyons, forming a continuous piece of land like a paradise. Occasionally, you can hear the singing and laughter of men and women farming from across the mountains and fields. Zhongli Jiju knew these villages and introduced them to Su Buling one by one, but in order not to attract the attention of interested people, she did not say hello. The three people walked like this. In fact, at noon, they saw a high mountain in the distance, and a waterfall flowing down from the top of the mountain was faintly visible. But when they got near the high mountain, it was already dusk, and the stars were already visible on the horizon. When they arrived at the place, Su Buletinling breathed a sigh of relief and carried Zhongli Chuchu on his back, walking over the mountains and ridges. Although there were two soft cushions behind his back and a small hand holding a handkerchief to wipe sweat beside him, after the long journey, he also gave birth to a child. A bit tired. Zhongli Jiju stood on the top of the mountain and pointed to the large stockade surrounded by terraces at the foot of the mountain. The buildings were staggered and stacked on top of each other. In the distance, he could see figures like rice grains walking among them. There was a bonfire burning in the middle of the stockade, and a few people gathered in it. Compared to the stockade, the scale is so large that at first glance there are not many people living there. Zhongli slept all the way and woke up at this time. He looked up and saw the place where he grew up. His eyes were a little dazed for a moment, and then he showed a look of joy. He raised his hand and pointed to the small courtyard on a low mountain. "That's Niang Mountain, my home is there. Zhongli Jiju was born here." Needless to say, the kindness in his eyes was evident. He noticed someone was looking at him at the foot of the mountain. He looked at it for a moment and raised his hand. "Actuan, what are you looking at in a daze?" "I am your Aunt Jiju." The two children at the foot of the mountain were stunned for a moment, and then they hurriedly waved and shouted to the back. Then many people appeared from the stilted building in the cottage, including women, children, old and young. Zhongli Jiju had been away for several years, and when she arrived at home, she felt a little homesick. She walked down the hillside with her skirt in hand and called out, "Ms. Sir, we've arrived. Let's get down." Su Buling was originally calm, but seeing this enthusiastic scene, he was really a little nervous, as if his son-in-law was visiting the house for the first time, so he hurriedly followed and prepared to leave. Zhongli Chuchu lay on Su Buling's back. After taking 2 steps, he realized something was wrong. He patted Su Buling's shoulder with a red face. "Put me down, I'm home." "Oh, yes." Su Bulenling then let go of Chu Chu, and the 3 of them walked towards the large village in the mountains. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 725. When the wanderer returns, all the old and young in the Miao village come to the center of the village. Most of them are women and children. Adult men are basically invisible. Even if they are, most of them are injured and injured. Their faces are filled with joy of welcoming relatives and friends. But it was difficult to hide the helplessness and sadness hidden deep in his eyes. When Zhongli Jiju walked near the village gate, she noticed that the atmosphere was completely different from the past. The smile on her face faded a little, and she looked towards the 2 children who ran over to greet them. "Actuan, Kingzi, where are your father and the others?" The child called Xian looks about 12 or 13 years old at most, with a smile on his face. "Going out to fight, Aunt Ju will go back to the village first." Second uncle knows this. The little girl next to her was thought to be Xian's younger sister, about 10 years old. At this time, she ran up to Chu Chu, pulled Chu Chu's sleeves, and asked curiously, "Sister Chu Chu, I heard that you married a prince outside the mountain. Is this eldest brother?" When Zhongli Chu Chu returned to the village, she was obviously gentle and virtuous. She smiled softly and didn't know how to explain it. Su Buling came here incognito. There were many people in the village, so he pointed out his identity directly. It is estimated that everyone in the 18th village will know tomorrow. Zhongli Jiju could only shake his head and said with a smile, "It's all rumors from outside. Chu Chu is not married yet. This is my man, his name is Su Mang, from the Central Plains." "Su Mang?" Zhongli Chu Chu frowned, glanced sideways at his master, and almost said, "Shameless." Su Buling was quite satisfied with the pseudonym and greeted the 2 children with a smile. When Kingzi heard that it was Juju's man, his eyes clearly showed some surprise. He looked at Su Buling carefully. "Aunt Ju, you're not saying that you want to be Warren and not marry. If you want to marry, you have to marry a strong man with a neck thicker than your waist. This fierce brother looks like noodles. He's not fierce at all. Being Warren. The neck is thicker than the waist." Zhongli Chu Chu stared, wanting to laugh but feeling bad about it, so he could only raise his eyes to the sky and cough lightly. Zhongli Jiju's face turned red. These nonsense words in the village in the past were exposed by children in front of her husband. Naturally, she felt embarrassed and secretly glanced at Su Buling. It's the Bakui, not the Warren, I used to talk about it as a joke. Zhongli Jiju is the doctor in the village. Kingzi was seriously ill when he was a child, and it was Jiju who cured him. Kingzi regarded Jiju as his own relative. A relative whom they hadn't seen for several years suddenly brought back a man. Naturally, the Xian brothers and sisters felt a bit of scrutiny in their hearts. Xian is young but very strong. After looking at Su Buling, who is obviously not big and round, he immediately wants to give Su Buling a meeting gift and invite Su Buling to have a wrestling match. This is considered the rule in the village for men to come and marry girls. But Su Buling couldn't do anything with a child. After seeing what Xian meant, he glanced at a big stone outside the village gate. The stone was shaped like an animal. It was probably placed at the door as an auspicious sign. It weighed about 700 to 800 kilograms, was large and heavy, and fell to the ground. Judging from the traces on the ground, it must have been pushed not long ago. Seeing this, Su Buling easily lifted the big stone and straightened it, and also adjusted its position left and right. His movements were as gentle as lifting a broom that had fallen on the ground and leaning it against the wall. Hiss! The young and old who were walking away from the village raised their eyes and saw this scene. They all stopped in their tracks with astonished expressions. Many people rubbed their eyes, wondering if they had seen it wrong. Xian walked in front and talked with Jiju. He was secretly thinking about how to declare a challenge. He was stunned for a moment when he saw the movement in front. He thought something had happened. When he looked back, he found that the big stone next to him had been lifted up. My sister Kingzi was standing there with his eyes wide open, staring at the tall foreign man. Xian paused, turned around, looked at the big stone with his mouth wide open, and then at Su Buling, who was as if nothing had happened. He didn't say anything for a long time. Is this a human being? Su Buling was originally planning to show off his skills casually, but when he saw the looks in his eyes from the villagers and elders in the village, it was a bit exaggerated. He thought he had accidentally disturbed the auspiciousness of the village. He hesitated, then raised his hand to hold the big stone and put it on the ground. He fell to the ground, returned to his original position, and looked at the silly wife. Jiju, can't this thing be moved? Xian was so shocked that his jaw almost dropped. Everyone in the village likes capable men. Zhongli Jiju took the man back to the village. Seeing the reaction of his father and fellow villagers, he was naturally a little happy in his heart. He waved his hand and said, "You can move, don't worry about it, just go in, uncle and aunt are waiting." Su Buling felt more relieved now, followed Jiju into the village, and rubbed Xian's head. Xian still opened his mouth wide. After watching Su Bulenling pass by, he was still unaware that someone could lift a big stone so easily. He ran to the big stone, worked with his sister, and tried to lift it, but of course it didn't move, and then he followed in a hurry. "Brother Meng, how did you do this? Teach me." Su Buling looked enigmatic and said casually, "Eat more and it will be fine when you grow up." Xian is not stupid. There are many men in the village who have never been able to push the stone, and there are only a few who can lift it. What about eating? Inside the village, because the head of the house, Aunt Gui, and several old people were taken away by the government, the current head of the house is Aunt Gui's younger brother, who is called Erbo Li by Jiju. Uncle Li was over 50 years old and had a slight limp in his left leg. He was using a cane and watching Su Buling and others walking over. He was also shocked by the scene just now. Hearing Jiju's call, he came back to his senses and raised his hand in a hurry. "Axuan, take your sister to the fourth aunt's place to prepare wine and food. The guests are here and you don't understand any rules." When Xian saw the elder speaking, he ran down angrily to greet him and cook. The young and old standing in the village all looked at Su Buling in amazement. Some said hello, and some asked Jeju and Chu Chu in a low voice. There was obviously admiration and adoration in their eyes. Su Buling naturally acted as a man who didn't say much good things about him, and followed Jeju to greet his fellow villagers. Because something had indeed happened, the welcome in the village was not too warm. After the warm welcome, Erboli let everyone disperse and took the three of them to sit down in the old house in the village where they discussed the matter. Several elderly people, the old people are all here. Zhongli Jeju had been thinking about the village. At this time, he told the news he had learned on the way and asked, "Uncle Li, is it the government that Zhan Bao, the white-eyed wolf, colluded with?" Uncle Li held his crutches with both hands, a sad look on his face, and sighed. "We all know it privately, but Zhan Bao doesn't admit it." The official in Laos who originally knew the village, but this time he turned against him for some unknown reason. He asked 200 people not to tell him anything. He didn't bother to investigate afterwards, so he just said that the village was hiding bandits. Came to get people. In recent years, Zhan Bao has been walking around in the 18 villages and has become famous. He went around telling the village not to go against the government. At that time, he did not stop the government. Your Aunt Gui and uncle were taken away by the government. Later, Zhan Bao pretended to go to the government to intercede, and reduce the number of people he wanted to the previous years, but there was no news from Aunt Gui and the others. I also asked people to go to the government several times to ask, but I couldn't see anyone even if I spent money. We went to Zhan Bao to ask for an explanation, but Zhan Bao only said that he was inquiring. After asking several times, he became angry and even beat the fourth child. He is still lying on the bed unable to get off the floor. Zhongli Jeju frowned. After listening for a while, he couldn't sit still and said coldly, "That white-eyed wolf, I'll go find him tomorrow and ask for an explanation." Erboli originally wanted to stop the situation, but he had been angry for so long and there was no one he could count on in the village. He didn't want to have someone who could stand up for the village. He looked at Su Buling next to him, thought for a moment, and nodded. "You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. The Prince is very fierce." Author, Guan Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 726. 5 miles away, on the shady slope behind 3 mountains, another Miao village was built. It was smaller than the old village, but had more people. Thanks to the relationship between Zhan Bao and the government, most of the labor force was still in the village. The 18 villages used to be very united and listened to the old village, but unity is not something you can eat. Zhan Bao was good at martial arts. When he was young, he wandered around Liuzhu and met many rich kids from outside the mountains. Later, relying on these relationships, he did a lot of convenience for the village. Over time, he naturally won the hearts of the people and became a person who could do things in the 18 villages. The stilt house in the center of the village was the residence of Zhan Bao, the head of the family, because the heads of the old village were detained by the government, and now Zhan Bao naturally became the person in charge of the 18 villages. At this time, in the guest room in the building, 7 or 8 heads of other villages were talking to Zhan Bao, hoping that he could communicate with the government and reduce the annual tax to be paid at the end of the year. Zhan Bao sat in the main seat and talked with everyone. He was not wearing the local costumes of the village, but the robes commonly seen in the Central Plains. He also had a jade ring on his finger. He was tall and strong, and looked a bit heroic. The people in the villages were discussing with each other, and suddenly someone ran in from outside, came to Zhan Bao and said, "Brother Bao, the 9th girl of the old village is back. I was visiting relatives there just now, and I happened to see the 9th girl coming back with Chu Chu and a man. From what she called him, the man seemed to be the ninth girl's man. The heads of the house, big and small, all quieted down after hearing this and looked at Jean Bao a few times. The 18 villages are considered a family, and anything that happens will spread the next day. When Zhongli Jiju was young, he was a famous handsome bird in the village. All the unmarried men in the 18 villages came to ask for marriage, and there were many fights for this, and Jean Bao naturally went there too. Originally, Jean Bao's martial arts surpassed those of the 18 villages, and he had a great chance. However, he defeated all the competitors and came to propose marriage, but was rejected by the old village on the grounds that Jiju was still young. After that, Zhongli Jiju ran away alone and wandered around for several years before returning. It was said that she almost became a beauty similar to concubine Zhou, and her appearance was naturally more beautiful, like a fairy. Now not only the 18 villages, but also the surrounding Miao villages heard about it, and those who came to propose marriage almost squeezed the gate of the old village. Jean Bao defeated all the competitors again and ran to propose marriage to Zhongli Jiju, but Zhongli Jiju said she would not marry and was rejected. Jean Bao hit a wall again and again, and naturally he was angry. He made trouble in the village, and was scolded and driven out of the village by Aunt Gui, the head of the village. Since then, Yinpo village and Niang mountain have not been in contact. A few days ago, when the old village had an incident, many people speculated that Jean Bao was resentful and retaliated, but it was definitely not easy to say it in front of him. Now Zhongli Jiju is back, and she brought a man with her. Something big might happen. When Jean Bao heard the news, his face really changed. However, he didn't seem surprised that Zhongli Jiju came back. Instead, he frowned and said, "Brought a man? What kind of man?" The man who delivered the message was a little serious when he said this. He raised his hand and gestured. "He is 2 fingers taller than Brother Bao, and much more handsome than Brother Bao. However, he is not as strong as Brother Bao with delicate skin and tender flesh. He wears clothes from our side, but he looks more like a scholar in the city." Jean Bao was slightly dissatisfied, brought a scholar back. The man shook his head. "He is not a scholar, but he is so strong. In the past, when the 18 villages robbed the bride, only Brother Bao could push the big stone at the gate of the old village and then lift it up. The man brought back by Miss Ju can also push it and then lift it up. It looks quite relaxed." When everyone heard this, they couldn't help but show surprise in their eyes. If a strong man can push down a stone weighing 800 jin, he can do it. If a single person can lift it up, there has only been one Jean Bao in the 18 villages in all these years. He is really amazing. When Jean Bao heard this, the anger on his face turned into confusion, and he turned his jade ring. "One person? How did you lift it up?" "One person, I didn't see clearly how he lifted it up, and in the blink of an eye, the stone was lifted up." Seeing the people in the village were stunned, he pushed the stone down and moved it back. Jean Bao was a little surprised, silent for a moment, nodded slightly, and glanced at everyone. It's a good thing that the 9th Miss is back, but there has been a lot of chaos outside recently. There have been several tragic massacres in the village. It's not appropriate to bring back an unknown outsider. I'll go and take a look tomorrow. Everyone naturally understood what he meant. With new and old grudges, they will definitely come to cause trouble. However, Jean Bao was well known for his martial arts, so the small villages couldn't say anything. They just changed the topic and continued to talk about the annual tax. The climate in the mountains of southern Xinjiang is pleasant. You can see the bright starry sky and the bright moon as if you can touch it. Su Buling, Jiju, and Chuchu walked along the path halfway up the mountain and came to a slightly flat place. A small medicinal garden of a small scale appeared in front of them, and at the end was a small courtyard with white walls and green tiles. On the opposite side of the mountain is the waterfall that falls 3,000 feet straight down. The scenery can be said to be unique in the world. Zhongli Jiju walked in front and felt particularly close to his own 1/3 acre of land. He raised his hand and pointed to the pond in the distance. "Husband, that pond is not ordinary. It is very cold. The water is still icy cold in the hot summer of June. Ordinary people will definitely get into trouble if they drink too much. However, it is very effective for boiling medicine." The dragon-locking goo was also raised at the bottom of the pond. "It took me several years." Su Buling walked around and admired Jeju's small nest. It was just like the farmhouse in Dahua Valley, with beautiful mountains and rivers. If the family of 3 lived here without worries, they should have a comfortable life. Zhongli Chuchu was walking behind him, but after Zhongli Jeju unlocked the door, she seemed to remember something and ran into the yard quickly. Before Su Buling could see clearly, she covered the iron rings, spinning tops and other toys in the corner of the yard. Obviously, she didn't want Su Buling to guess her childish appearance when she was a child playing in the yard. Su Buling didn't say anything about it. He looked down at the 2 little people on the door and smiled. Zhongli Jeju also saw the little people on the door, and there was a sense of being in another world in her eyes. Chuchu was once a little bean sprout, and she was also a big girl under 20 years old. For a little thought in her heart, she really raised Chuchu as her own daughter. Who could have thought that she would encounter so many messy things later, and the little girl who once regarded her as a teacher and a mother became a fierce housekeeper. And her thoughtful and caring teacher became caught in bed, snatched her apprentice's man, and had sex with her husband in front of her apprentice. Zhongli Jeju felt a little ashamed, her face blushed slightly, and she didn't feel anything, so she lowered her head and entered the yard. The yard had not been taken care of for several years, and it was full of fallen leaves and weeds, and there was a small horse pen next to it. Su Buling glanced at it and remembered something, so he said, "Chuchu, your camel is still with Zhangbo, the governor of Yuzhou. Now Yuzhou is occupied by northern Qi, and Zhangbo has fled to Qingzhou. I wonder if the camel is still there." Zhongli Chuchu's white camel was found by Jeju with great effort. She actually missed it very much in her heart, but the whole Yuzhou was lost, and she didn't expect to find it back. She just whispered, "When you fight in Yuzhou in the future, I will go to see it. If I can find it, it's good. If I can't find it, send Zhangbo to the western regions to raise camels." Su Buling comforted him and started to clean up the yard with Jeju. Zhongli Jeju was famous for coming and going without a trace when she traveled around the world. She was very cautious since she was a child, and even Su Buling suffered losses several times when he rashly broke into the house. It is impossible that there is no decoration for the house at home. Back home at this time, in order to prevent someone from deliberately luring Su Buling over, Zhongli Jeju carefully checked the traps and secret signs that had been set up before leaving. After confirming that they had not been destroyed, he opened the door, took out the bedding from the cabinet and spread it on the wooden bed, and then took out the clean sheets he brought with him and spread them on top. Zhongli Chuchu slept in the small house next door. After cleaning up the fallen leaves in the yard, she returned to her room, closed the door, and did not allow Su Buling to visit her boudoir. The yard was not big, with 1 main house and 2 bedrooms. Su Buling could not stay in the kitchen. After a few glances, he came to the main house. The candles had been lit in the house, and the little sparrow flew into its birdcage. It was probably because it had been away from home for too long, and it was swinging on the window swing with the birdcage. Zhongli Jeju leaned over to make the bed in the light of the lamp, her buttocks facing outwards, round like a big ball wrapped in blue cloth, with many silver ornaments hanging on her dress, making some light noises as she moved. The southern Xinjiang style of dress naturally added a different flavor to the already gorgeous Zhongli Jeju. Su Buling walked into the room, took a closer look, his eyes slightly brightened, walked up to her, raised his hand. Snap! Zhongli Jeju, who was carefully putting on the sheets, shuddered at the burning feeling on her back, turned over suddenly and sat on the quilt. Her eyes were angry and embarrassed, and she kicked Su Buling lightly with her embroidered shoes. "Are you going to die? You left without making any sound, you scared me to death." As she said that, she raised her hand and rubbed the sore spot, and kicked again in anger. Su Buling looked at the cozy little house decorated elegantly, frowned and said, "Don't think too much, there are mosquitoes." Zhongli Jiju didn't believe it at all. "Where I live, there can't be mosquitoes. Gu means poisonous insects. Do you think Gu King is just a random name?" Su Buling sat down next to him and pressed Jiju on his legs. "It's true, if you don't believe me, just look." Snap. Ouch. Zhongli Jiju was a little anxious, turned her head and held Su Buling's hand. Okay, there are mosquitoes, I won't argue. Be gentle, Chuchu is across the street, if she hears, she will scold me again." Su Buling was satisfied, smiled, and fell on the quilt, lying on his back. "I'm not careful, my wife, do it yourself." Zhongli Jiju looked slightly annoyed, glanced at the lighted window across the street, and finally couldn't resist her husband's temptation, got up and closed the window quietly. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Zi. Chapter 727. Outside the window, the cold spring gurgles, and the hazy white moonlight sprinkles on the window paper. Zhongli Chuchu lies on her side on the pillow, holding a crystal clear ice flower hibiscus pendant in her hand, and watching the various shapes and colors in the boudoir. Although it is located in Miaojiang, this house is no different from the boudoir of a lady from the Central Plains. There are many books on the bookshelf. Many of them were brought by Jiju's grandfather when he fled. The covers are yellowed, but they are clean and tidy. In addition to the pen, ink, paper, and inkstone, there are also piano tables and painting tables in the room, which are common items in the boudoirs of rich ladies. They are of high workmanship and are very valuable. They are all carefully prepared by Jiju. After Zhongli Chuchu was carried out of the fire pit by her master and came here, she has never suffered a day of hardship. Although she lives in a relatively poor Miao village, she lives a life of luxury. Even her hair and nails are carefully cared for, and she uses all kinds of mountain delicacies and magical medicines to wash her face. Maybe the ladies of the royal family are not as extravagant as her. She used to be extremely attached to her master because he was the first person in the world who treated her so well. She ran away from home because she found that her master treated her so well and had other purposes, not just liking her, a little girl that no one wanted. However, after crossing mountains and seas, walking from the east to the west, from the south to the north, and going around the whole world, Chuchu's stubborn thoughts had long been let go. In any case, at least she and her master are still together and safe, and they can continue like this forever in the future. Now lying on this small bed again, Zhongli Chuchu's eyes have regained the attachment and warmth of her childhood, but the jade pendant in her hand still makes her eyes look a little more. After all, there were 2 people in the room when she left, and 3 when she came back. A man who suddenly appeared in the middle of the road came between her and her master, changing the simple family affection and filial piety of her childhood. Ah! Zhongli Chuchu stroked the jade pendant with her slender fingers, wanting to fall asleep, but she couldn't fall asleep. I remember that when she was a child, every night, her master would come to her in the middle of the night to tuck her in. If she found that she was not asleep, she would lie beside her and hug her, telling her stories from all over the world until she fell asleep with a smile. Now, the master will definitely not come over at night. It is estimated that she is sleeping with that man, telling him stories, tucking in the quilt, etc., so how can she care about her? Thinking of this, Zhongli Chuchu pursed her lips, and she was actually a little jealous. But she couldn't tell whether she was jealous of Su Buling for stealing her master, or her master for stealing her man. Maybe it was both. Zhongli Chuchu lay there for a long time and couldn't fall asleep, so she sat up again, put on her shawl, and opened the door. The lights in the house opposite had been turned off, and there was no movement at all, as if they had gone to bed. However, Zhongli Chuchu knew the time between the two of them. Now should be the time when the master raised his neck and yelled, but there was no sound, probably because Su Buling covered his mouth and couldn't yell. Zhongli Chuchu glanced at it, then picked a leaf from the small tree beside the courtyard wall, sat on the small bench under the eaves, put the leaf to his lips, looked at the stars in the sky that were within reach, and played Phoenix Seeking Phoenix. Woo woo. The melody was gentle and looming among the mountains. Zhongli Chuchu played the song, and there was actually a bit of mischief in her eyes, imagining Su Buling's expression of despair and the master's ashamed expression. After just a moment of playing, there was no movement in the house. Zhongli Chuchu was a little confused. Under normal circumstances, the master should pretend to be woken up, ask a few questions in a daze, and then let her go back to sleep. How could he pretend not to hear it? The tune stopped. Zhongli Chuchu thought for a moment, got up and walked to the yard, listening attentively. There was a buzzing sound in the house, which was obviously not a sexual intercourse, but more like the sound of mosquitoes flying around. How could there be mosquitoes in the house? Zhongli Chuchu was a little confused, took 2 steps forward, and called out, "Master!" There was no response from the house, but something small gently hit the window, making a slight sound. Zhongli Chuchu's heart sank, secretly aware that something was wrong, and hurried to the door. But just as he was about to raise his hand to push the door, he remembered something, ran to the side room to get the smock to prevent poisonous bees from stinging, and put it on. Earlier, Su Buling was lying on the newly laid bedding, holding the back of his head like a master, waiting for his silly wife to come and serve him. Zhongli Chuchu quietly took down the support rod, and after the window was closed, the room became a little quieter. She turned around and glanced at Su Buling. Her bright face was obviously flushed with shyness. She walked to the bedside, raised her hands to take off the silver ornaments on her head and waist, and placed them on the dressing table next to her. Her long hair was scattered and swayed gently in front of the candle light. Su Buling admired her from top to bottom, and he didn't even want to move. It seemed that he didn't even want to take off his clothes. Zhongli Chuchu was a little annoyed, but he had no choice. He squatted down by the bed, took off Su Buling's boots, blew out the candle, and sat sideways beside Su Buling. Zhongli Chuchu's personal belongings, in addition to the leg ring tied on her leg, also had a small porcelain bottle sandwiched between the dumplings. At this time, she lifted her skirt, first pulled down the leg ring, picked it up with her toes and placed it on the dressing table, then unbuttoned her clothes, took out the small porcelain bottle from it, and put it aside. Su Buling adjusted his posture, raised his eyebrows, and signaled to come over. Zhongli Chuchu bit her lower lip and glared, then pressed on Su Buling, lowered her head and pressed her lips together. Rustle. In the birdcage by the window, the little sparrow was swinging on the horizontal bar. Seeing the two shameless people fighting again, it turned its head slightly bored. The window was closed and it couldn't get out, so the little sparrow flew to the dressing table, raised its claws and kicked the small porcelain bottle containing the dragon-locking goo. Gurgle gurgle. The bottle rolled several times on the table, and the sound of a small beetle flapping its wings could be heard inside. Obviously it was woken up. The little sparrow jumped on the dressing table, ran to the other end and stepped on the small bottle, and kicked it to the other side again. After several times of this, the dragon-locking goo in the bottle was buzzing, and it was obviously a little unbearable. Zhongli Chuchu was holding the beetle in his hand and his breathing was a little unstable. He tilted his head and saw the little sparrow making trouble nearby. He was annoyed and fierce, then he leaned over to pick up the small porcelain bottle, opened the lid with his fingers, and let the little beetle out. Su Buling's mouth was empty, and he sighed a little disappointedly. He tilted his head to look at Yi, who was chasing the little beetle everywhere, and smiled. "Isn't it afraid of the dragon-locking goo?" Zhongli Jiju crawled back and said absent-mindedly, "We have raised it together since we were young. It's just a joke. What is there to be afraid of? All things have spirituality, and birds and beasts have joys, anger, sorrows, and happiness. You won't understand even if I tell you." Su Buling nodded thoughtfully, and wanted to talk about the knowledge of man and nature, but Jeju covered his face and could only say The room was quiet, with only the sound of the little sparrow chasing the beetle. Zhongli Jeju half closed her eyes gradually blurred, her body undulating, and just as she was getting into the mood, she suddenly saw a small beetle flying around in the room, crawling under the bed. The little sparrow followed behind, standing next to the boots and looking out. Just after taking a look, it suddenly flew into her arms as if frightened. Zhongli Jeju woke up instantly, and realized that something was wrong. She quickly held her breath and concentrated her energy, and listened to the movement below with her ears slightly moving. Su Buling was also a little confused, but the warrior instinct was still there. After discovering something strange, he did not move around. He held his breath and concentrated his energy to look at Zhongli Jeju, asking with his eyes. Zhongli Jeju's slightly flushed cheeks gradually became serious, lying motionless, staring at the side of the bed. Su Buling glanced sideways and gradually heard a buzzing sound, which was the sound of the dragon-locking insect flapping its wings, mixed with very small sounds, flying around under the bed. Soon, two blurry black dots flew out from under the bed. It was obvious that the dragon-locking goo was going berserk and was chasing it in the air. In front of the black beetle was a much smaller insect, which was glowing green in the moonlight. It seemed to be very afraid of the dragon-locking goo and was running around in the room like a headless fly, looking for a place to hide. Although Su Buling didn't know what this thing was, he had been infected with the dragon-locking goo before and had some knowledge of goo insects. To raise goo, hundreds of poisonous insects are usually sealed together, killing each other and feeding on flesh and blood. The last one left is the goo. After becoming a goo, it is impossible to coexist with other poisonous insects and will only eat weak poisonous insects. The dragon-locking goo is called the Goo King, and it must be invincible among poisonous insects. It is not sure whether this green little mosquito in front of it is a poisonous goo, but it can arouse the ferocity of the dragon-locking goo, so it must not be a simple thing. You know, when Jeju took out the dragon-locking goo to let it out for a walk, there were no mosquitoes or flies within 100 feet, the little beetle was too lazy to care about ordinary insects. This was the first time Su Buling had seen such a hunting situation. Buzz buzz buzz. The two little insects flew around in the room, and a few times they even flew near the curtain. Su Buling and Zhongli Jeju hugged each other, still keeping a distance from each other, staring at the poisonous insects without moving, except for their eyeballs. Even their eyelashes did not move. The little sparrow seemed to know the danger, hiding between the two of them, not daring to move, completely losing the courage when chasing the dragon-locking goo just now. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 728. The two people and the bird stood still between the curtains for a while, their eyes gradually becoming serious. The dragon-locking goo is a beetle, which is relatively large among poisonous insects. It makes a buzzing sound when flying, and its speed and flexibility are obviously not as good as the little insect in front. The little insect is very fast. Except for the occasional sight of a faint green luster, it is difficult to hear even the sound at other times. If the house was not closed and there was no exit, it would have escaped long ago. It was the environmental restrictions that allowed the dragon-locking goo to chase after it. Not knowing the details of the poisonous insect, Su Buling did not dare to catch the insect rashly. If the stalemate continued, the dragon-locking goo would probably not be able to catch the poisonous insect all night, and no matter how high his and Jeju's martial arts were, they could not hold their breath for too long. He could only look at Jeju and ask for countermeasures. Zhongli Jeju looked at the leg ring on the dressing table and tried to hook it with his feet, but as soon as there was a slight movement, the poisonous insect felt it and began to fly over here, so he could only stop and continue the stalemate. Not long after, there was a sound of a door opening outside, followed by the sound of Chu playing a tune. The poisonous insect noticed it, but it was too far away and it seemed difficult to tell where it was, so it just wandered around the window. Soon, Chu realized something was wrong, and the footsteps were getting closer, so she shouted, "Master!" At this moment, the poisonous insect being chased by the dragon locking goo suddenly accelerated its speed and rushed directly to the source of the sound, and naturally crashed into the window paper. The dragon locking goo that followed closely behind also crashed into the window, making a light pop dash sound, swaying a few times, and then flew up to continue chasing. Tap tap tap. The footsteps came to the door. Zhongli Jeju's eyes became anxious, and he wanted to shout to stop it. Su Buling also frowned slightly, and his muscles were gathering strength and ready to go. Fortunately, Chu had followed Zhongli Jeju since he was a child, and he had learned something. After realizing something was wrong, he ran away, then ran back, and raised his hand to push open the door. Squeak! The door just showed a crack, and the poisonous insects running around in the house rushed over directly. Zhongli Chu had been prepared for it, and covered herself with a gauze net from head to toe. The moment the door opened, she heard the sound and identified the position, and used the butterfly catching net to cover it. The poisonous insects and the dragon locking goo reacted very quickly, and instinctively changed direction to avoid the net. Zhongli Chu took the opportunity to slip in and closed the door to prevent the poisonous insects from flying out. After the poisonous insects felt the sound of people's breathing, they rushed to Zhongli Chu's face like crazy, but unfortunately they were all blocked. It was obvious that the gauze net under the veil was shaking slightly. The gauze net can only prevent bites, not poison. Zhongli Chu carefully held the insect net and held his breath to catch poisonous insects in the house. But the poisonous insects flew too fast, circling around Zhongli Chu to find a breakthrough. Zhongli Chu couldn't even see the shadow clearly, so he could only rely on the weak sound to catch poisonous insects like hitting mosquitoes with his eyes closed. Swish! After Zhongli Chu failed several times, she was worried about the safety of her master and Su Buling, and glanced at the bed on the left. Fortunately, both of them were safe, but so big. Zhongli Chu's body was obviously stiff, and she instinctively turned her head to spit softly, but soon reacted and continued to concentrate on catching poisonous insects. On the bed, Su Buling lay motionless, and he had been scared away by the sudden poisonous insect. But Chu ran in to rescue him, and there was no danger for the time being. The scene was ambiguous, and slowly Su Buling's eyes moved and glanced down. After Chu came in, Zhongli Jeju's face alternately showed embarrassment and tension. She was already ashamed, and when she found that Su Buling had evil thoughts at this time, she was immediately annoyed and glared at him with murderous eyes. But at this time, what could Su Buling do? He is not a god, how can he control his instinct? This look is just adding fuel to the fire. Swish swish swish. Zhongli Chu ran around the boudoir with a net in her hand, chasing poisonous insects. She ran to the curtain several times. With the help of the dim moonlight, she could see the scene inside clearly. Zhongli Chu's hands were shaking. After seeing that the poisonous insects did not spray poisonous smoke, she could not help it. She relied on the smoke to protect herself and began to nag. "Master, what's going on? You can't even see such a big poisonous insect." Zhongli Jeju was about to cry, but she couldn't move, and she couldn't even explain. She could only maintain such an embarrassing posture and act like a wooden man in front of her apprentice. Su Buling lay on the pillow, looking a little embarrassed. He looked at Chuchu's clumsy insect catching, feeling a little anxious. Fortunately, the room was so small that the poisonous insects were blocked by the smoke and could not bite Zhongli Chuchu. They could only fly towards the source of the sound like moths to a flame. After a few times, Chuchu learned to be smart and put the net in front of her. She deliberately spoke, and the poisonous insects followed the sound and flew in. Zhongli Chuchu quickly closed the mouth of the net, and even the dragon-locking goo that followed closely was caught in it. The two poisonous insects fought together in the net, making a buzzing sound. Zhongli Juju had been holding it in for too long. Seeing this, he took a few breaths suddenly, and then turned over as if he had been electrocuted, pulled the sheets to wrap himself, and even covered his face. Su Buling also pulled the clothes over his body, sat up, and said, "I'm scared to death, what is this?" Zhongli Chuchu held the net, and didn't dare to touch it. Looking back, he saw that his master was wrapping himself like an ostrich, and couldn't help but said angrily, "Master, what are you doing? Come here quickly." Zhongli Juju's face turned red as if she was about to bleed. She fell to the ground without saying a word, wrapped the thin blanket tightly around her body, and ran to Chu-Chu barefoot. She didn't dare to look at her apprentice's eyes. She just took the net and looked at her through the moonlight. "Look carefully." Zhongli Chu-Chu pulled off her blouse and took a few glances. Then she remembered the scene she had just seen. She couldn't help but raised her hand and slapped her master on the buttocks. "Are you really having fun? I'm almost blind." Su Buling put on his robe and walked up to him, looking slightly embarrassed. It happened so suddenly. "I didn't expect that there were mosquitoes under the bed." Zhongli Chuchu had just witnessed the live erotic palace, and was too embarrassed to look at Su Buling. He just turned his back to the lit candle and hummed softly. "You didn't notice it?" Could it be that she didn't notice it either? After all, she grew up in South Vietnam and didn't have any precautions. Zhongli Juju's face turned red and she didn't dare to reply. She looked carefully through the light of the candle, with some doubts in her eyes. "This bug is so weird, a bit like a sound fly. How could there be such a thing in the house?" Su Buling came closer and took a look. The fighting inside the net had stopped. Locking dragon goo was lying down in it to eat. The green poisonous insect, which was originally no bigger than a grain of rice, had been dismembered, and its original shape could no longer be seen. He asked in confusion, "What is a soundfly?" Zhongli Juju recalled, "I heard from old people in other villages before that there was an insect plague hundreds of years ago. This poisonous insect appeared in several villages in the mountain. It would fly into people's mouths in their sleep. If you accidentally eat them, after that, the food will become tasteless and sleepless at night. If it is not cured, it will be worse than death after a long time. I have even looked for this poisonous insect in the past, and I haven't seen even the slightest clue. Why is it in the house? One came out." Su Buling thought for a while, "Is this thing a poison raised by humans?" Zhongli Juju shook his head. "Unlike goo, this poisonous insect is said to have evolved from the corpse fly. There are also natural ones. Most of them are born from animal corpses in the deep mountains and old forests full of miasma. If people want to raise them, I don't have the ability anyway." Su Buling nodded and glanced at the room. There was no smell at all. It was obvious that there could be no rotting corpses. When something goes wrong, there must be a monster. He couldn't be so lucky. He encountered a rare poisonous insect just after arriving in South Vietnam. Su Buling opened the window and glanced outside. "Someone is probably targeting us. Now that we have entered this courtyard, whether I was poisoned or not, I am afraid I will have been discovered in South Vietnam." Zhongli Juju looked solemn. She had just come back to check the mechanism and secret messages. There were no signs of destruction. Even Chu-Chu might not know all of these things. If someone could enter her house without leaving any trace, it could only be someone who did it secretly, who was specialized in this, and whose conduct was higher than hers. Zhongli Jiju said cautiously, the person who can poison me is definitely not an ordinary person. But that person probably doesn't know that I figured out the dragon locking goo myself. After I failed this time, I will definitely use other methods. The enemy is in the dark and I am in the light. What should we do? Su Buling thought for a moment, turned around and picked up the weapon. I'm going to Yinpo village now to have a look. If someone is planning it, Zhan Bao must be a chess piece. He probably knows something. If he goes there late, he will be silenced. You go stockade, stay in crowded places. Zhongli Jiju thought it made sense and quickly prepared to go out. But before she opened the door, Su Buring and Zhongli Chuchu teamed up to hit her on the buttocks. Ah! Only then did Zhongli Jiju remember that she was not wearing any clothes, and quickly ran back to put on her skirt. Su Buling was ready to go out with his knife, but he didn't know where Yinpo village was, and he didn't know Zhan Bao. If the three of us went together late, we might miss the point. It was not safe to leave Chu Chu alone, so we directly picked up Chu Chu who was standing next to her. Chu Chu, please show me the way. Jiju, you should be careful alone. Zhongli Jiju was not good at hitting people, but her ability to protect herself was far beyond that of ordinary masters. She nodded and said, go back quickly, don't be brave. Zhongli Chuchu was a little confused and lay on Su Buling's shoulder. I'll go by myself. You ran so slowly, Zhan Bao was so cold when you passed by. Su Buling responded, then carried Zhongli Chuchu out of the house, flew up from the mountains and fields, and flew away into the distance. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 729. The sky was full of stars, and on the side of the waterfall, a man in black with a cane, stared at the small courtyard on the opposite hillside with hawk-like eyes. A crow landed on the cane, and its scarlet bird pupils were like two snake pupils that were ready to eat. After waiting for a long time in the autumn wind, he saw the two people enter the main house one after another, and then went to check on the little girl. The man in black tightened his hands a little, secretly feeling that something was wrong. There was only one poisonous insect, and it was impossible to knock down two people at the same time. It was probably a mistake. Sure enough, not long after the little girl went in, a man came out with a knife and fled into the mountains. Alas! Under the black cloak, a slightly disappointed sigh was uttered, and the voice was hoarse, like a living dead without vitality. The man in black gently raised the cane, and the black crow flapped its wings and flew towards Kyoto. He turned around and walked towards Yinpo village a few miles away. The man in black took a few steps and found a meteor-like afterimage across the mountains and fields under the moonlight. The speed was so fast that the branches and leaves behind began to shake after running through the forest for a few steps. In the blink of an eye, he reached a small hill. The man in black was obviously a little surprised. After staring at it, he put away his crutches and ran away. After leaving the Miao village of Niang Mountain, they soon entered the deep mountains and old forests. There was only a rugged path in the forest for people to walk. In order to save time, Su Buling directly took off and landed on the cliffs of the mountains and rushed to the Yinpo village behind the three mountains in a straight line. The autumn night was already a little chilly. When running at full speed, the cold wind penetrated the thin skirt and blew into the legs from behind. Zhongli Chuchu was not cold, but it felt quite strange, especially after seeing Su Buling's thing just now. Zhongli Chuchu lay on Su Buling's shoulder and felt uncomfortable all over. As her long hair fluttered in the wind, she twisted her body slightly, trying to get her waist away from Su Buling's cheek. Su Buling was busy on his way, and when he saw Chuchu was restless, he raised his hand and patted her. "Don't move, what if you fall into the ravine? Don't touch me." Zhongli Chuchu was originally feeling weird, and when she was touched, she showed a look of shame and anger in her eyes, and raised her hand and lightly hit Su Buling on the waist. Su Buling blinked his eyes and smiled helplessly, "Just reminding you, not touching you." Zhongli Chuchu started chatting anyway, so he said, "You are just a hypocritical bully of women. We just came back, you just last night, today and master did something, aren't you tired?" "Not bad." Zhongli Chuchu clenched his fists and continued, "Don't be so anxious if you are not tired. There are poisonous insects everywhere in South Vietnam. Don't you know to check before going to bed? I have to save you." Speaking of this, Su Buling smiled, "Chuchu is very smart. She didn't rush in rashly. I was ready to get up and catch the insects by force. Of course, I'm not Manzi. After all, I have been through the rivers and lakes. I'm just a little worse than master." While speaking, Zhongli Chuchu thought of the scene he just saw and couldn't help frowning and said, "I found that you don't know how to repay kindness. My master is so good to you, more than me, and you can say that you have given your body and soul to you. But what about you? I have been here for so long, and I found that you are gentle and considerate to other women, but you treat my master as a concubine." Su Buling tilted his head slightly, "How is it possible? I always treat everyone equally." Zhongli Chuchu snorted, "Do you think I didn't see it just now? You lie down like a master, letting a woman do that. I have seen medical skills, male and female are compatible, and the man should be on top and the woman on the bottom. You are reluctant to use even this little bit of strength, and let my master do it all, and you still say that you treat everyone equally." Su Buling really treats everyone equally, even Yu Fu sometimes has to do it herself, but these boudoir matters are naturally not easy to talk to Chuchu in detail, just chuckled and didn't answer. Zhongli Chuchu muttered a few words, and the two of them crossed 3 mountains. A slightly smaller Miao village appeared at the foot of the mountain. Even after 3 o'clock in the morning, some firelight could still be seen, and someone was patrolling at night. Zhongli Chuchu jumped off his shoulder and followed Su Buling, raising his hand and pointing to the stilt house in the middle of the village. "That's Zhan Bao's house. He sent so many people to patrol at night. I guess he was also guilty and afraid that our village would attack him." It was common for mountain villages to fight each other, so Su Buling was not surprised and walked quickly to the vicinity of the village. Chuchu wanted to sneak in, but Su Buling beside him was swaggering and rushed in a straight line. Zhongli Chuchu ran behind him and asked in confusion, "What are you doing? Aren't you sneaking in secretly?" Su Buling entered a Miao village that was not even a bandit village, which was like a strong dragon entering a quagmire. He could flatten the village with just a roll. What was there to sneak into? Naturally, he rushed in directly at the shortest distance. He walked quickly and asked, "Can I kill someone?" Zhongli Chuchu hesitated, shook her head and said, "The 18 villages are all one family, and we are all related to each other. It's just that Zhan Bao, a rat, has appeared. Just beat him up." Su Buling nodded lightly, broke a tree trunk as thick as a woman's wrist from the roadside, cut the branches and leaves with a knife to make a stick, and strode towards the village. Who? The village gate was closed at night. The man patrolling behind the wooden fence with a Miao Dao saw the person running over, and immediately became alert and shouted loudly. Su Buling rushed to the nearby area and said loudly, "Juniang's man, Zhan Bao, come out." The sound was so loud that the entire village could probably hear it, and the village suddenly became a little noisy. The man on patrol was a little confused, but when the other party came knocking on the door, he naturally didn't need to talk nonsense and was ready to beat the person out with his sword in hand. But before a few men could open the village gate and go out, they saw Su Buling, who was holding a wooden stick and was in a menacing manner. He jumped up more than 10 feet away and kicked the tall village gate. There was a loud click, the huge wooden beam behind the door was kicked off, and the two doors fell backwards. Several men were frightened by this battle, and they all retreated and were stunned. Before they had time to speak, Su Buling took a wooden stick to the left and right, and hit several people on the head like a whack-a-mole. Dong dong. After a few muffled sounds, the village gate immediately became clear. Su Buling did not slow down at all, carrying a wooden stick into the large village of hundreds of people, and rushed directly to Zhan Bao's house. When the other men in the village found someone knocking on the door, they all ran out to stop them. Without exception, they were knocked unconscious with a stick before they even got close, so that everyone who came after them stopped and looked at him in horror. The stilted building at the rear. Brother Leopard! Brother Leopard! With such a big commotion, it stands to reason that Zhan Bao, the head of the family, should have come out long ago, but there were constant shouts and shouts in the village, and there were no lights on in the stilted building. Su Buling's face darkened, knowing that something was wrong, so he ran with all his strength, taking one step for more than 10 feet, and after more than 10 steps, he flew up, knocked open the window of the stilted building with his knees, and at the same time drew out the waste knife with his right hand and covered his mouth and nose with his left hand. Click. Windows were broken and splinters of wood flew everywhere. Su Buling glanced in the air and confirmed that there was no outsider in the room. On the ground behind the window, there was a muscular man lying on his side, covering his chest with his hands. He had not yet died, his face was twisted and livid, and he was squirming with difficulty. Judging from the position where he fell to the ground, he must have heard the noise outside and stood up to open the window when he was assassinated and fell to the ground. Just now, Su Bulenling landed on his feet and ignored Zhan Bao on the ground. Instead, he quickly turned his head and looked out the window, scanning the inside and outside of the cottage. Unfortunately, apart from the noisy crowd in the village, there were no suspicious signs inside or outside the village. On the ground, Zhan Bao clutched his chest, his eyes were bloodshot and his face was ashen, and his whole body was covered with twisted veins. He stared out the window and made some noises with his mouth open. Choo choo! Come up quickly! Su Buling quickly turned around, squatted next to Zhan Bao and glanced at him. He didn't know what kind of poison Zhan Bao had been poisoned, but he would definitely not survive. He took out the detoxification pill made by Jeju from his arms, wrapped his hand in a handkerchief, stuffed it into Zhan Bao's mouth, and said in a deep voice, "Who is it? Tell me quickly and I will avenge you." Zhan Bao swallowed the detoxifying pill mixed with the poisonous blood, but the poison had obviously entered his heart and lungs and could not be relieved at all. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Perhaps knowing that he had been exploited and silenced and that he had no chance of survival, Zhan Bao used all his strength to write the word prince crookedly on the ground with his obviously convulsed fingers. Before he could finish writing, he started to bleed from his orifices and his skin it collapsed and almost turned into a pile of bloody rotten flesh. Zhongli Chuchu rushed upstairs and pushed the door open. Zhan Bao had made no sound. She looked at the bloody corpse on the ground in shock, and quickly stepped forward to pull Su Buling up. "Be careful, it's a rotten bone needle, the blood is poisonous, it's a cruel method." Su Buling quickly threw away the handkerchief, exited the room, took the water bag from his waist and rinsed his palms. Several elders from Yinpo village ran over when they heard the noise. When they saw the scene in the house, their expressions suddenly changed. Leopard. This. Most of the cottages in southern Xinjiang know how to use poison. Seeing the scene in the house, the few old people knew whether they were beaten to death and quickly closed the door. "Spread away, don't come close, spread out." Su Buling still felt uneasy after washing his hands. He ran to a place with running water and washed them carefully. After taking Jeju's detoxification pill, he felt a little more relieved and looked towards the Sifang Mountains in a blink of an eye. The person who was here just now was killed with poisonous needles from a distance. Zhongli Chuchu now understood the depth of his opponent's skills. He stood next to Su Buling and looked around. Have you found out the whereabouts of Aunt Gui and the others? Su Buletinling's face was solemn. If his opponent came for him, then the few unimportant old men in the village would definitely be in trouble. He shook his head and said, Zhanbao wrote Prince before he died. He was probably his backer. I didn't ask anything else. Prince. Zhongli Chuchu thought for a moment. The person in charge of the South Vietnam court is the second Prince Chenju. Is it possible that Zhanbao has hooked up with such a big shot? No one but people of this level dares to challenge me. Su Buling looked at the messy cottage, thought for a moment, then turned around and walked out of the cottage. Zhongli Chuchu followed behind, somewhat clueless. What should we do now? What else can we do? Find out the purpose. That's the Prince of South Vietnam. I will kill Emperor Dayo, and the prince is just a chicken feathers. That's true. Thank you, ha ha ha. I can't afford to offend you for the 30,000 reward. They are all chapters of about 3,000 words. It seems pointless to ask for a monthly ticket. Please subscribe. Currently, there are 7,000 subscriptions. I hope to touch the butt of 10,000 subscriptions before finishing the book. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 730. It didn't take too long to go to Yinpo village and then back to Niang Mountain. Su Buling took Chu Chu over the mountains and ridges back to the stockade. Only then did the young and old in the stockade gather. Zhongli Jiju was inquiring with Uncle Li whether any outsiders had been to the stockade recently. Seeing Su Buling coming back, Zhongli Jiju walked up quickly, checked the two of them first, and then asked after making sure they were not injured. How's it going? There were many people in the village, so after Su Buling explained a few words to the village elders who came to inquire, he took Jiju to the small courtyard in the middle of the mountain. He said softly on the way. Zhanbao has been silenced. This incident in South Vietnam must be directed at me. Before Zhanbao died, he wrote Prince, which probably refers to the second Prince Chenju who is now in charge of politics. Currently, 20,000 Ziliang troops are on their way. When the army arrives, they will attack South Vietnam no matter what. It is also a good thing to be sure that someone is behind the scenes. If it is really the South Vietnamese court, then there will be no need to use disappearance as an excuse for a fight. We have to go to Yangzhou to investigate this matter and find out the whereabouts of Aunt Gui and the others. Zhongli Chuchu followed beside him and interjected, Zhanbao was hit by a poisonous needle. His skin burst and his orifices bled to death. It looks like the rotten bone needle that master said. Rotten bone needle. When Zhongli Jiju heard this, he frowned slightly and his face became serious. Su Buling was also shocked by Zhanbao's miserable appearance just now. If nothing else, judging from the death appearance alone, the rotten bone needle was more vicious than the dragon-locking poison. He asked, what are rotten bone needles? Zhongli Jiju thought about it for a moment. It is Sikongji's signature stunt. Many masters in the South Vietnam arena have been killed by this poison. The rotten bone needle is extremely poisonous. Once infected, there is no chance to take medicine, and the limbs will be hit. It's possible to cut off an arm to save your life, but it's hard to save a person with a broken torso. As far as I know, Sikongji seems to be the only one in South Vietnam who knows how to do this. If he wants to silence him, he shouldn't use such an obvious method. When Su Buling heard that it was Sikongji among the 7 stars of Nanyu, he suddenly felt that no wonder he moved so fast. If a random fish was so powerful, then Nanyu wouldn't have to rush in. He shook his head and said, Sikongji must have been watching us near the stockade just now. After realizing that the poison didn't hit me, he ran to silence me. But I ran too fast. He probably didn't have time to deal with the scene, so he could only kill Zhang Zhan with a poison needle from a long distance. Leopard. Zhongli Jiju thought about it. Su Buling was invincible in the world, he couldn't race horses in the mountains, and there were only a few people in the world whose light kung fu was faster than Su Buling's. That might be true. Sikong Ji is rumored to be from the 100 Insect Valley before Jiazi. He has been famous for many years, but the dragon has always been invisible. No one has ever seen him alive. Even if he recognizes him, it is of no use. He still has to go and see what he is. Prince. I don't know if there are any spies nearby. Let's go back to the yard first and leave quietly under the cover of night. Su Buling looked around. Although there was moonlight in the mountains and forests, it was obviously not easy to find potential informants. He took the master and apprentice back to the small courtyard, closed the doors and windows, and then released the tool bird to go to the Sifang mountain forest. Find someone. After half a night of tossing, both the master and the apprentice were a little shaken. After Zhongli Jiju returned to the room, he began to check every corner to avoid any other undiscovered poisons. Zhongli Chuchu was also helping in the house, but just after searching around the house, he saw two small bells placed next to the pillow. The situation was urgent and he didn't have time to clean it up when he went out. Zhongli Chuchu blinked his eyes, walked over, picked it up and looked at it. The bell is made of sterling silver, and the cap on it is aqua blue. It was made by Xiao Xiang. The workmanship is exquisite to the extreme, and the sparkle is more beautiful than jewelry. Zhongli Chuchu obviously felt like Kui Zioan that it looked good, but couldn't figure out where to wear it. She raised her hand and shook it, then tried to put it on her head. Jingle. The clear ringing of the bell alarmed the couple in the house. Zhongli Jiju's body froze slightly. After finally returning to normal, his face turned red again. He subconsciously tightened his clothes and glanced back. Seeing Chu Chu putting it on her head innocently, not knowing what it was for, she secretly breathed a sigh of relief and lowered her head as if she could see everything. Su Buling was packing the package nearby. When he heard the sound, he turned around and looked embarrassed. He walked up to him and said with a smile, "Chu Chu, what are you doing?" Zhongli Chuchu quickly took back her hand and saw that Su Buling was already in front of her. When she put it back, it was just a cover-up, so she said casually, "This thing is very beautiful. The jewelry you gave to master." Su Buling blinked. The gift from Xiang. Well, it can be considered jewelry. Zhongli nodded. Chuchu looked back and forth for a long time, and then asked, "Why are you wearing it? I have never seen master wearing it. If you have seen it, something is wrong." Su Buletinling muttered something secretly and glanced at Chu Chu's clothes subconsciously. Chu Chu is a standard beauty from the western regions. She has fair skin, tall legs, and a figure that is more spectacular than that of a woman from the Central Plains. Although Su Buring has never seen it with his own eyes, he has a rough idea of the size when he is carrying it. She is bigger than Aunt Lu and Bao Bao sisters. In a circle, I just wear loose clothes and don't look too big. Thinking of the turbulent scene of Chu Chu with the bell, Su Buletinling's heart skipped a beat. He turned away and explained, "If you hold it in your hand and play with it, you can't put it on." Zhongli Chuchu felt that Su Buling's expression was a little strange. Just looking at the delicate little bell, he couldn't think of any improper use, so he said "Oh" in doubt. Zhongli Jiju turned her back to the two of them, her heart pounding. She was really afraid that Chuchu would find out about her tricks again, so she continued, "It's not an important item, take it if you like, and make 2 more when you go back." Zhongli Chuchu really liked these 2 little bells, and thought it would be more appropriate to hang them on the camel's neck as camel bells, so she didn't refuse, and put them in her arms and kept them. "Thank you, master. We are both master and apprentice, why thank me? Anyway, you will have to." Nothing. The clouds covered the moon, and the sky and the earth darkened. There were still lights in the streets and alleys of the capital Yangzhou, but Nanyu was not like Chang'an. In the middle of the night, there were not many pedestrians on the streets. Many places in Yangzhou city were modeled after Chang'an city. Chaohuang Street in the middle was modeled after Zuk Street in Chang'an city, and the Imperial Palace was also at the end of Chaohuang Street, but in terms of scale and number of buildings, it was much smaller than the Imperial City of Chang'an City. It can only be said to be grand, not majestic. The palace gates of the Imperial City have been closed, and the harem is sparsely populated. There are not many palace maids and concubines. In fact, it is not much different from Songji's harem. However, as emperors, Chen and Songji are very different. Songji has few people in his harem. He is indifferent to the world and obsessed with power. Even the queen can be used as a pawn. Chen is more like an ordinary man. He became the prince at a young age with extraordinary intelligence. After he succeeded to the throne, he was also diligent in government affairs and managed the court in an orderly manner. Later, he was addicted to the gentle country and could not extricate himself. He favored only one person among the 3,000 harems. After losing his beloved wife, he was unable to recover and became crazy and bedridden. As an emperor, Chen is definitely not as good as Songji, but as a man, Chen is more real than Songji. The only thing in common between the two monarchs may be that their endings are not very good. The autumn colors are bleak in the deep palace. The eunuchs stand outside the bedroom, bowing and standing quietly. In the bedroom, Chen, who was pale and thin, almost skin and bones, lay on the upper imperial couch. His face was pale and twisted. He opened his mouth and shouted hoarsely from time to time. His turbid eyes kept looking at the young man next to him. Perhaps only at this time could he be a little more stable, not struggling in pain, and let the wailing spread throughout the palace. Next to the imperial couch, the Prince Chenju, who was dressed in a blue robe, sat beside him. He was about the same age as Su Buling. He did not look at Chen on the sickbed, but at a portrait in the bedroom. Among the 8 winners of Suan He, Kui Zioan's painting was called Peach Blossom Looking Back, Ning Yuhi's was called Sword Dance, Xiao Xiang's was called Xiao Xiang Bamboo, and the one hanging in the Nanyu Palace City was naturally Concubine Zhou's South Flying Geese, which depicted a woman looking at the geese flying south. Chenju was very similar to the woman in the portrait, and his appearance was naturally not vulgar, but he did not have the noble and ethereal aura in the scroll, but instead had some worries about worldly affairs. Chen Jin, who had gone mad and lost his mind, obviously recognized his son in front of him. He opened his mouth, but could not say anything, just 2 meaningless sounds. Prince Chenju came back to his senses, looked at his father next to him, thought about it, and said something in his heart. There is a war in the Central Plains, the Su family in the western regions usurped the country, and the world is in a mess. Grandpa said that we should take advantage of the situation to compete for the Central Plains. Father is too conservative. If he is sober, he will definitely not agree. It is too risky. However, my Chen family has stayed in this poor and bad South Vietnam for too long. When the time comes, we will suffer the consequences. I think Grandpa is right. On the imperial couch, Chen Jing could not understand the words at all. He just looked at his son in front of him with his dim eyes, staring at him. Chen Ju might have been talking to himself because Chen Jin was already crazy and could not understand. The voices continued for a long time until the eunuch came to report that Duke Angguo was waiting outside the imperial city. Chen Ju stopped talking, bowed to Chen Jin, and turned to leave the bedroom. As soon as he walked out of the door, a nearly shrill wailing sounded in the bedroom again. It sounded like he couldn't bear to let his son go and wanted him to come back. Chen Ju stood outside the bedroom, hesitated for a moment, and asked the eunuch to close the door and left quickly.